August 1942. At the Henschel factory in Kassel, Germany, engineers watched as the first production Tiger I tank rolled off the assembly line. 56 to 57 tons of solid steel armor, carrying a formidable 88mm gun that had already proven its devastating effectiveness against Allied tanks in North Africa. At that moment, the Tiger represented the most powerful armored fighting vehicle on Earth. A technological achievement combining breakthrough firepower with unprecedented protection, Adolf Hitler wanted these machines thrown into battle immediately. Despite the concerns of experienced commanders, despite unfinished testing that had revealed severe mechanical defects, despite all principles of sound armored doctrine, the Führer demanded that Germany's newest superweapon enter combat as soon as possible. Within weeks, only 4 of these engineering marvels would bog down in the swamps southeast of Leningrad, transformed from symbols of German industrial might into smoking wrecks and immobilized hulks trapped in Russian mud. The Tiger's combat debut became one of the most catastrophic deployments of armored vehicles in the entire Second World War. This was not a story of overwhelming enemy firepower or brilliant Soviet tactics. It was a wound inflicted by Germany upon itself, a catastrophe born of political impatience, terrain utterly unsuited for heavy armor, and mechanical complexity that far exceeded Germany's ability to maintain it in the field. The consequences would echo far beyond those first desperate weeks, stripping Germany of surprise, handing Soviet intelligence a treasure trove of technical data, and establishing a pattern of misuse that would haunt the Tiger throughout its service. To understand the catastrophe, we must first understand the machine. The Tiger I that left Henschel's factory in August 1942 represented a quantum leap in armored warfare. At 56-57 tons, roughly twice the weight of the medium tanks forming the backbone of most armored divisions, the Tiger dwarfed its contemporaries. Its main armament, the 8.8mm KWK-36 L-56 gun, could penetrate any Allied or Soviet tank armor from well over a mile away. The frontal hull armor reached 100mm thickness, while the gun mantlet in some sections measured up to 200mm of hardened steel. Most contemporary anti-tank weapons simply bounced off. Physically, the Tiger was enormous, 6.3 meters long and 3.56 meters wide, barely fitting on German railway cars without special preparation. It could reach 45 km/h on roads, impressive for such a massive vehicle, though its cross-country mobility proved far more problematic. The 5-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator machine gunner, had to master an exceptionally complex platform requiring coordination and precision. But the most distinctive feature of the Tiger, visible to anyone studying its silhouette, was its Schachtelaufwerk overlapping wheel suspension. Each 800mm road wheel interlaced in a chessboard pattern, a masterpiece of German engineering. The design distributed the Tiger's tremendous weight over a wide track area, reducing ground pressure to about 1.4 kg per cm², remarkably low for such a heavy machine. The torsion bar suspension gave an uncannily smooth ride, yet what seemed an ingenious solution would soon reveal itself as a fatal vulnerability. Behind the Tiger's impressive specifications lay a rushed development. The shock of encountering Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks in 1941 had accelerated Germany's heavy tank programs dramatically. Tests in June and July 1942 revealed, in the dry language of engineering reports, serious defects in final drives, exhaust systems, and transmissions. Not minor issues fixable in the field, but fundamental design flaws requiring a complete re-engineering. Hitler, however, would not wait. Despite these test results, he ordered immediate production of 200 Tigers. The first Tiger was officially completed on 4 August 1942, and production ramped up to 25 units per month, a rate wholly inadequate for Germany's needs and requiring twice the man-hours of comparable tanks. The rush to mass production meant that design flaws would torment crews in combat rather than be corrected on test ranges. Early models received the Maybach HL210 engine, producing 485 kilowatts 650 HP. Impressive on paper, until one considered that it had to move 56 tons of steel. This gave the Tiger a power-to-weight ratio of just 11-12 HP per ton, dangerously low for a combat vehicle expected to maneuver over varied terrain. The operation manual itself admitted the fragility of the system. Crews were instructed never to exceed 2,600 RPM despite the engine being rated for 3,000. Even the manufacturer knew it couldn't bear the strain. The Maybach Olvar pre-selector transmission was equally problematic. It offered 8 forward and 4 reverse gears via a complex hydraulic mechanical system. Cutting edge in theory, but hopelessly overstressed by the Tiger's immense weight. Early units suffered chronic transmission failures as gears literally tore themselves apart under load. Worse still, no proper logistics structure existed to support such complex machines. When the first Tigers arrived in Russia in autumn 1942, spare parts allocations were appallingly inadequate. 1 replacement engine and 1 transmission for every 10 tanks. Once a major component failed, and failures were frequent, the tank might sit immobilized for weeks or months. Maintenance itself was nightmarish. The overlapping wheels meant that replacing even 1 damaged inner road wheel could require removing up to 9 others first, a task taking days under ideal workshop conditions, impossible under fire. A minor mechanical fault could render a 56-ton Tiger as useless as if its gun had been destroyed. Even at peak efficiency, Henschel could produce only 25 Tigers per month in 1942, while Soviet factories turned out hundreds of T-34s monthly. Every Tiger lost to mud or mechanical breakdown was an irreplaceable blow. By April 1944, output finally peaked at 104 Tigers per month, too late to alter the war's course. This mismatch between doctrine and reality lay at the heart of Germany's failure. Doctrine versus reality. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Germany's armored warfare, had laid down his principles in his 1937 work Achtung, Panzer. His philosophy was clear. The most dangerous enemy of a tank is another tank, and new weapons must be held back until they can be deployed in decisive mass for maximum shock. The Tiger embodied the tank versus tank concept, a mobile fortress built to dominate duels through superior firepower and armor. But by August 1942, Germany's strategic situation was shifting toward defense, not breakthrough. The gulf between doctrinal ideals and battlefield reality was about to become a chasm. Context: Operation Nordlicht. For more than a year, German forces had besieged Leningrad without success. Operation Nordlicht, Northern Light, was planned as the decisive blow to finally capture the city. A massive artillery bombardment, followed by Luftwaffe airstrikes and a coordinated ground assault. The newly delivered Tigers were meant to spearhead the attack, a steel fist to shatter Soviet defenses. On paper, it looked magnificent. In reality, nature and timing would conspire to ruin it. Just days before Nordlicht was set to begin, Soviet forces launched the Sinyavino offensive on 19 August 1942. The German High Command was caught off guard. By 28 August, units earmarked for Nordlicht were thrown into defensive action instead. The grand assault on Leningrad never happened. Yet Hitler's direct order remained. The Tigers must fight, immediately. They were loaded onto trains and sent east, months ahead of schedule, with untrained crews, unresolved mechanical issues, and no supply infrastructure. For the officers on the ground, refusal was unthinkable. Major Richard Merker, commander of the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion, Schwer Panzerabteilung 502, knew disaster was imminent. He warned that the swampy, forested terrain southeast of Lake Ladoga was utterly unsuitable for 56-ton tanks. His superiors ignored him. The order came from Hitler himself. Major Richard Merker, commander of the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion, Schwer Panzerabteilung 502, found himself in an impossible situation. On August 19 and 20, his unit received its first 4 Tigers, chassis numbers 25,002 through 25,005. Merker reviewed the reports of the Leningrad sector with growing unease. The area southeast of Lake Ladoga was heavily forested, with poor drainage that produced extensive bogs. Late August rains would only make it worse. By his professional assessment, the terrain was utterly unsuited for a 56-ton tank. He advised against deploying them there. It was sound military judgment from an experienced officer. The terrain violated every principle of proper tank use. The vehicles were untested in battle, their mechanical flaws unresolved, their crews undertrained. Yet Merker's warnings went unheeded. Because Hitler himself had ordered their use, no one dared resist. Heinz Guderian, the father of Germany's armored doctrine, was reportedly furious at the decision. Everything about this deployment violated the principles he had laid down. New weapons should debut in concentrated surprise attacks, not piecemeal. They should strike on suitable ground, not swamps. They should be held back until numbers guaranteed decisive results. Instead, only 4 Tigers were sent into battle, attached to infantry units rather than forming an independent armored force. Doctrine demanded concentration. Reality delivered fragmentation. Doctrine required open ground for maneuver. Reality offered mud and forest. Doctrine urged patience. Reality squandered surprise for the sake of 4 tanks that were likely to bog down before reaching the front. German officers across the chain of command shared Merker's doubts, but the culture of obedience left no room for reason to override politics. Hitler's impatience outweighed professional judgment, and the price would be paid by field commanders like Merker and their doomed crews. The terrain of doom. The geography around Lake Ladoga was perhaps the worst terrain imaginable for heavy armor on the Eastern Front. The southern shore of Europe's largest lake was covered with dense willow and alder forests, rooted in lowlands, where poor drainage had created vast peat bogs. These weren't firm moors. They were deep, sucking swamps capable of swallowing vehicles whole. The Signavino Heights, rising about 150 meters above the surrounding landscape, offered a tactical objective both sides fought for repeatedly. But every approach to those ridges led through narrow trails and forest paths, natural death traps for tanks. August rains turned the already marshy ground into a quagmire. It was the prelude to Rasputitsa, Russia's infamous season of mud, which had tormented invading armies since Napoleon. By late August 1942, the ground was wet, soft, and treacherous. A German report noted that major tank forces cannot operate effectively in marshland, where movement is restricted to narrow roads and tracks. For a 56-ton Tiger, it was a nightmare. The fatal journey east. On August 23rd, the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion was loaded onto rail cars bound for the Eastern Front. 4 Tigers sat on flatbeds, ready for the exhausting journey to the Leningrad sector. Their crews, men who had trained on the tanks for only 3 days, contemplated the machines they barely understood. It was revolutionary technology, the most advanced tank in the world, and its operators were dangerously underprepared. There had been no time for comprehensive crew training, no time to build the instinctive understanding that separates competence from mastery. Imagine the mood aboard that train. The men had been chosen for a prestigious mission, to command Germany's newest and most powerful weapon. But 3 days of familiarization were criminally insufficient for a vehicle of such complexity. Drivers had to master the preselector gearbox, learning when to shift and how to manage the massive weight across unstable terrain. Commanders had to coordinate their crews, maintain situational awareness, and handle battlefield communication. Gunners had to manage the mighty 88mm gun capable of killing at extreme range, but requiring precision and discipline. All of them knew, at least subconsciously, that they were being thrown into battle before they were ready. into a terrain they hadn't studied, against an enemy they underestimated, in machines they barely knew. August 29, 1942. The debut and the disaster. The Tigers arrived at the rail station of Munga, southeast of Leningrad, on August 29th. That very day, the day of their arrival, they were ordered straight into combat. No reconnaissance, no terrain survey, no preparation. The Tigers rumbled off toward the front line, and within hours, disaster struck. 3 of the 4 Tigers broke down. 2 suffered immediate mechanical failures before even engaging the enemy. The third overheated, its HL-210 engine unable to handle the stress. None of them reached their assigned positions. The Tigers' debut on August 29, 1942, was a total failure. The overlapping wheel suspension, that brilliant Schachtelaufwerk design, revealed its fatal flaw. In dry conditions, it provided smooth travel and excellent weight distribution. In mud, it became a liability. Each wheel acted like a scoop, collecting wet soil and organic matter, packing it between the interleaved layers until it jammed solid. Hundreds of kilograms of mud built up inside the suspension, adding weight and friction that strained the transmission to breaking point. The Maybach gearbox, already struggling with the tank's mass, began to grind and scream as the hydraulics tore themselves apart. Transmissions literally shredded themselves under the load. Engines overheated as drivers revved beyond safe limits trying to free their tanks. Cooling systems, designed for test tracks in Germany, failed in the humid heat of Russian swamps. Engines seized, and in some cases, caught fire. Inside the tank, imagine being inside one of those Tigers. You sit in the most powerful tank in the world, encased in armor thick enough to shrug off anything the enemy can throw at you. Your 88mm gun could obliterate any Soviet tank you might meet. And yet, you're helpless. The engine howls, the RPM needle pinned in the red as the driver tries desperately to move forward. Smoke seeps into the fighting compartment. The transmission groans and shrieks like tearing metal. Through your vision slit, you see another Tiger ahead of you, dead, smoke pouring from its engine deck. A second rocks violently as its driver tries to escape the mud, only sinking deeper. The pinnacle of German engineering, defeated by wet earth. By nightfall on August 29th, only one of the 4 Tigers remained operational. The date became known within the battalion as the Day of Disgrace. Aftermath. On September 25th, additional Tigers and Panzer III tanks were sent to reinforce the unit, but the Tigers' reputation had already suffered. More importantly, the Soviets now knew that Germany had deployed a new heavy tank. The priceless element of surprise that Guderian and other strategists had urged preserving was gone forever, squandered in the mud for no gain. Germany's counterattack began on September 21st, involving 6 divisions attempting to repel the Soviet Sinyavino offensive. Tigers were assigned to support the infantry, but the ground was still the same. The same forests, the same bogs, the same rain. Conditions had worsened with the onset of autumn. On September 22nd, 4 Tigers advanced in support of the attack, forced to move single file along a narrow embankment and then through a forest trail, a tactical nightmare. Tanks are most vulnerable when confined to narrow routes, unable to maneuver. Their flanks are exposed, and ambush is inevitable. Soviet anti-tank crews needed only to wait for the Tigers to pass before striking from the sides, where armor was thinner. The forest reduced visibility to mere hundreds of meters, nullifying the Tigers' range advantage. The tanks could neither maneuver nor fight effectively. They were reduced to lumbering targets. All 4 broke down or became stuck. One caught fire, forcing the crew to abandon it. Another sank into the mud so deeply that no force could pull it free. Soviet shells slammed into the immobilized hulks. The German crews tried desperately to recover their tanks. Standard doctrine demanded recovery whenever possible, An immobilized tank could be repaired and fight again, but one left in enemy territory was lost forever. Yet recovery under Soviet fire proved impossible. Every attempt failed. Eventually, German command accepted that one Tiger would have to be left behind. Merker recommended destroying it immediately to deny the enemy any technical intelligence, a standard procedure. The order was refused. Headquarters demanded more recovery attempts. All failed. The Tiger stood stranded on no man's land until November 25, 1942, when its crew finally blew it up to prevent capture. The first total loss of a Tiger WWII, destroyed not by enemy fire but by mud, mechanical failure, and command arrogance. The operational reality for the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion in September and October 1942 was one of constant frustration. The unit never had more than 4 operational Tigers at any one time during that entire period. Mechanical breakdowns plagued the battalion relentlessly. A critical shortage of spare parts meant that many tanks remained out of action for weeks, sometimes months. Complex engines and transmissions failed repeatedly, leaving the machines immobile while crews waited for replacements that often never arrived. By the end of 1942, the battalion's loss report told a humiliating story. Of 6 Tigers lost, 3 had been destroyed by their own crews, not by enemy fire, but because they became irretrievably bogged down in peat marshes or suffered mechanical breakdowns that made recovery impossible. 2 more were blown up after becoming stuck. Another was lost due to catastrophic engine failure. At least 1 Tiger was captured intact by Soviet forces during the September fighting. The most expensive, most advanced tanks in Germany's arsenal were being lost not to enemy action, but to mud and mechanical inadequacy. Major Richard Merker had been right. The deployment he had warned against had gone ahead, and his predictions came true with almost perfect accuracy. The Tigers bogged down exactly as he had foreseen. Mechanical failures crippled them. Tactical conditions rendered heavy armor useless in swamp and forest. In November 1942, Merker was relieved of command. Though he had warned against the deployment, or perhaps precisely because he had dared to warn against an order originating from Hitler himself, he was blamed for the battalion's failures. The man who had been right was punished for being right. He became the scapegoat for a catastrophe he had predicted and tried to prevent. The fate of Major Merker's fate symbolized the dysfunction within the German command system. A professional officer who correctly assessed that 56-ton tanks would be ineffective in swampy, wooded terrain had the courage to speak up, fully aware that contradicting a Führer-approved plan could cost him his career. When events unfolded exactly as he predicted, he was still held responsible. His dismissal sent a chilling message throughout the Wehrmacht. To question Hitler's decisions, even when factually correct, was unforgivable. German command culture had no mechanism for facts to override ideology. Technical reality was to be subordinate to political will. Those who spoke inconvenient truths faced punishment, not praise. This pattern would repeat itself across the German army as the war progressed. The institutional inability to confront reality, to admit when circumstances had changed, or when assumptions had proven false. It would cost Germany dearly when the tide of war turned against it. Soviet discovery of the Tiger. The consequences of this disaster extended far beyond Merker's ruined career. Unnecessary losses of tanks and men, combined with a squandered element of surprise, gave Soviet intelligence an invaluable prize. In the course of September's fighting, the Soviets had already captured damaged Tiger components and documents. But the real windfall came later, on January 18, 1943. Operation Iskra, Spark, the Soviet offensive to break the siege of Leningrad, had begun on January 13th with the participation of 8 Tigers attached to the 96th Infantry Division. On January 16th, Soviet troops captured 1 Tiger that had been damaged by artillery fire. But 2 days later, near a small workers' settlement known as Posyolok No. 5, they found something extraordinary. Tiger number 121, chassis number 250254, abandoned almost intact. Its engine and cooling system had failed, that same chronic mechanical problem that had plagued the Tigers since their first deployment. And the crew had fled without properly destroying the tank. The Tiger was found frozen in the winter cold, hatches open, its systems largely intact. For the Soviet soldiers who stumbled upon it, the scene must have been surreal. Here stood a massive German tank, larger than anything they had ever faced, abandoned as if by miracle. The crew had fled in such haste they hadn't followed standard destruction protocols. No demolition charges, no damage to the gun or vital components. The Tiger stood there like an early Christmas gift for Soviet intelligence. The treasure inside Tiger 121, Soviet engineers discovered what could only be described as a complete technical library. There was an entire collection of documents, a concise operating manual, a maintenance log detailing mechanical problems and repairs, a brand new technical data sheet with performance specifications, and even the crew's personal tools and sidearms. Everything the Soviets needed to understand the Tiger's strengths and weaknesses lay within reach, handed to them by German carelessness. The maintenance log alone was worth its weight in gold, providing detailed records of recurring mechanical failures, part replacements, and service notes. This was not merely a captured tank. It was a full dossier on the Tiger's reliability and design flaws. Both captured Tigers were sent to the proving ground at Kubinka, near Moscow, where exhaustive testing and analysis began. Soviet engineers paid particular attention to the automatic fire suppression system, a safety feature that would later influence their own tank designs. They analyzed the armor composition to study its metallurgy and resistance. Barrage tests revealed critical tactical insights. The 76.2 mm gun of the T-34 could not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor, but 57 mm anti-tank guns could pierce the side armor at ranges between 800 and 1,000 meters. Tests of the Tiger's 88 mm gun against T-34 hulls showed just how inferior existing Soviet tanks were in direct duels. The conclusion was grim. Soviet armored forces needed urgent upgrades. The Soviet response. By April 1943, work began on modernizing Soviet anti-tank and artillery systems. On May 5, 1943, new tank and gun development programs were officially launched. The captured Tigers triggered a cascade of innovation in Soviet armor development. Engineers recognized the need to phase out the 76 mm tank guns in favor of heavier calibers, 85 mm, and even 122 mm weapons, capable of matching or exceeding the Tiger's firepower. The Su-85 self-propelled gun program was accelerated. Work intensified on the Su-152 assault gun, whose 152 mm howitzer could destroy any German heavy armor. The KV-85 heavy tank received production priority, alongside the IS-1 and IS-2 programs, which would culminate in Soviet tanks capable of facing Tigers on equal terms. The intelligence windfall also reshaped Soviet tactical doctrine. Commanders now knew to avoid frontal engagements with Tigers. The Kubinka tests made that clear. But they also identified vulnerabilities. The thinner side and rear armor could be penetrated by existing weapons at reasonable ranges. Soviet doctrine evolved accordingly. Use mobility and numbers to outflank Tigers, attack from the sides, use terrain for cover to close distance, and coordinate tank and anti-tank fire to create lethal crossfires. The premature German disaster thus became a Soviet opportunity. By handing over intact Tiger samples and complete documentation, Germany had unknowingly given its enemy the time to prepare effective countermeasures. When Tigers finally appeared in large numbers in 1943-1944, Soviet forces were ready, with weapons, tactics, and doctrine that might never have existed had Germany kept its secret longer. In the decade following the war, the reputation of the Tiger tank grew to mythical proportions. Popular history portrayed it as the ultimate expression of German engineering genius. an invincible steel monster that Allied crews feared more than any other weapon. Countless myths overshadowed the real story, as one historian noted, with often incredible claims of battlefield effectiveness. David Fletcher, the British historian of the Tank Museum, observed that legend, not fact, had shaped public perception of the Tiger. German weaponry attracted a cult of admiration whose enthusiasm for technology often exceeded its commitment to historical accuracy. Yet the combat statistics, when analyzed properly, reveal a far more nuanced picture. Numbers tell a different story. In recorded engagements, the Tiger achieved an average kill ratio of 11.5 enemy tanks destroyed for every Tiger lost in combat, an impressive figure by any standard. But that number tells only part of the story. It accounts only for Tigers destroyed in actual fighting, not those lost to mechanical breakdowns, fuel shortages, or self-destruction to prevent capture. When non-combat losses are included, tanks abandoned in the field, immobilized by mud, or destroyed by their own crews, the ratio drops sharply to roughly 3-to-1. The Tiger's mechanical fragility and logistical burden inflated its non-combat losses to a staggering degree. Reality was far less glamorous than legend. Production realities. Production numbers provide the necessary strategic context. From August 1942 to August 1944, German factories built between 1,347 and 1,355 Tigers in total. By comparison, American factories produced around 50,000 Sherman tanks in the same period. Soviet industry manufactured over 84,000 T-34s of various models. In purely statistical terms, the Tiger was insignificant in the material balance of the war. There were simply too few of them to do more than create localized tactical shocks. Warfare on the Eastern Front, and ultimately the outcome of the war, was determined by quantity, not quality. A lesson Germany learned too late, if at all. The economic equation. The economic reality made the Tiger even less sustainable. One Tiger required as much material as 2 medium self-propelled guns or 3 Panzerscharfürs. It consumed double the man-hours to produce. Germany could have built several cheaper tank destroyers for every Tiger produced. Even if resources had been unlimited, the time required to assemble a single Tiger meant production could never reach a scale that would matter strategically. By 1944, the Reich's most critical shortages were trained crews, fuel, and logistics, precisely the areas where the Tiger imposed the heaviest burden. It was a masterpiece that demanded an ecosystem Germany no longer possessed. Tactical versus strategic reality. On the tactical level, the Tiger was indeed a formidable opponent when it reached the battlefield. On firm, open ground, where its weight was not a liability, it could dominate engagements with devastating long-range firepower. Allied forces routinely devoted air power, artillery, and coordination between units specifically to counter Tiger movements. Its presence commanded respect and fear. But strategically, its impact was often exaggerated. Too few, too complex, too resource-intensive, the Tiger could never alter the course of a war fought on industrial scale. It was a brilliant technological triumph shackled by strategic failure. The disaster near Leningrad in August-September 1942 had set the tone for everything that followed. Premature deployment before mechanical issues were resolved, use on unsuitable terrain, tactical misuse that violated established doctrine, and strategic waste of resources for minimal gain. Doctrine undermined. Some of these flaws were partially corrected by 1943. Reliability improved as mechanical defects were identified and fixed. Crew training became more rigorous, and doctrine evolved to exploit the Tiger's strengths more effectively. But fundamental limitations remained. Mechanical complexity that exceeded field maintenance capacity, extreme weight-restricting mobility, resource demands unsustainable for a shrinking industrial base, and terrain constraints that limited operational effectiveness. The first deployment of the Tiger had exposed every major problem that would continue to haunt it throughout its service life. Mechanical unreliability born from rushed development and insufficient testing, terrain limitations caused by its sheer mass and delicate suspension, logistical intensity impossible to support in wartime conditions, and the critical importance of crew proficiency, which Germany could not maintain as the war dragged on. Some lessons from the 1942 catastrophe were eventually learned. Reliability improved as engineering flaws were addressed. Crew training became more disciplined as experience revealed the Tiger's strengths and weaknesses. Yet other lessons were never absorbed. Tigers continued to be deployed piecemeal, rather than in concentrated formations. They were often used defensively, the opposite of their intended breakthrough role. And the institutional model, in which political imperatives outweighed military judgment, remained unchanged. The Tiger's story thus mirrors the broader strategic dysfunction of Nazi Germany. Technology was prioritized over logistics. Faith in superior weapons was expected to compensate for weak supply lines and poor maintenance infrastructure. Quality was chosen over quantity precisely when the war demanded quantity. Political will overruled professional judgment. Complexity was celebrated when simplicity was what the battlefield required. The Tiger's intricate systems demanded reliable logistical support that simply did not exist. Individual brilliance in engineering could not overcome systemic failure in deployment, training, and maintenance. A counterfactual thought. Consider the counterfactual. What if the Tigers had been held back until mechanical issues were resolved, until crews were fully trained, and until enough were available for massed deployment? Had Guderian's doctrine been followed, concentration of force, proper terrain selection, preservation of surprise, the Tiger might have been far more effective. Its potential lay in its design, in its firepower and protection that made individual Tigers fearsome opponents. But could they have changed the war's outcome? Almost certainly not. Even under ideal circumstances, production numbers would have remained too low to affect the overall balance of material power. Resource costs would still have been unsustainable for an economy under siege. Germany's strategic position was already deteriorating beyond recovery. The catastrophe of August 1942 guaranteed that the Tiger would never even get its optimal chance to succeed. But even perfection would not have overcome the fundamental imbalance between Germany and its enemies. Soviet adaptation and the value of learning. The Soviet response demonstrated the power of institutional learning. Soviet forces systematically studied captured technology, identified weaknesses, and developed countermeasures. They accelerated the design of heavier guns and stronger tanks. They adapted doctrine based on combat experience. By the time Tigers were deployed properly and in greater numbers in 1943, the Red Army already had the weapons, tactics, and doctrine to counter them. The Tiger's mystique had been shattered in those swamps near Leningrad. Soviet commanders now saw it for what it was: dangerous, but not invincible. The human cost. The human dimension of this story deserves remembrance. Tank crews were sent into battle with minimal training on revolutionary machines. They were blamed for mechanical failures completely beyond their control. Some died inside burning tanks set alight by design flaws. Others watched helplessly as their Tigers became immobilized by terrain or breakdowns, forced to abandon the machines they had been told represented the pinnacle of German engineering. Major Richard Merker's career was destroyed for exercising sound military judgment. His vindication came only decades later, in historical analyses acknowledging that he had been right all along. His story became symbolic of a larger pattern: the punishment of truth-tellers, the elevation of Hitler's directives to infallible law, and the subordination of technical reality to ideological obsession. That pattern would cost Germany far more than a few tanks in a Russian swamp. The true cause of the catastrophe. Why did the Tiger's first deployment end in disaster? The answer lies not in a single factor, but in a cascade of failures: technological, tactical, and organizational. Hitler's impatience overrode rational military judgment, demanding immediate deployment, despite incomplete testing. The choice of terrain violated every basic principle of armored warfare, sending 56-ton machines into forests and bogs. Insufficient testing left mechanical flaws unresolved. Complex systems were rushed into combat before their weaknesses could be fixed. Piecemeal deployment contradicted German armored doctrine, which required mass concentration for maximum shock. The Tiger's complexity exceeded field maintenance capabilities. With only one spare engine and transmission per 10 tanks, mechanical breakdowns guaranteed weeks of immobilization. The command culture punished truth rather than rewarded it. Officers like Merker became scapegoats for disasters they had predicted. It was the perfect storm of technical, tactical, and institutional failure. A symbol of broader lessons. The Tiger's story is a microcosm of larger truths that extend far beyond the Second World War. Technology cannot substitute for strategy. Superior weapons cannot compensate for flawed deployment and inadequate support. Individual skill is meaningless without systemic infrastructure. The more complex a system, the more demanding its logistical support must be. And when ideology suppresses reality, disaster follows. When political desires override technical assessments, failure is inevitable. Short-term thinking breeds long-term catastrophe. The rush to deploy the Tiger sacrificed its potential for sustained effectiveness. These lessons remain relevant far beyond the battlefields of the 1940s. Modern militaries and organizations alike still struggle with the same paradox, balancing technological ambition with practical support and humility before reality. The irony of the Tiger. The irony is striking. In August 1942, the Tiger I was the most powerful tank in the world. Within weeks, its prototypes lay burning in the Russian swamp, defeated not by superior enemy weapons, but by mud, mechanical failure, and arrogance. The enemy was handed an intelligence treasure. Doctrine was violated. Commanders who warned against disaster were punished. The greatest tank failure of the Second World War occurred not on the battlefield, but in the decisions that led to its deployment. The legend of the Tiger endures, sustained by fascination with technology and its undeniable tactical brilliance when conditions were perfect. But the historical record tells a more complex story. Tactical effectiveness that never translated into strategic success, engineering genius constrained by logistical limits, and myth far outweighing actual impact. The catastrophe at Lake Ladoga became the template for everything that followed. Technology magnificent, deployment disastrous, an engineering triumph turned strategic failure. The Tiger's roar began as a whimper in the Russian mud. Epilogue. This has been a deep dive into one of the most significant armored failures of the Second World War, a study of how technical achievement, strategic context, and organizational dysfunction combined to turn a miracle of engineering into a cautionary tale. The story behind the legend reveals how arrogance, impatience, and systemic failure can squander even the most brilliant innovations. If you found this analysis valuable, leave a like and share this exploration of where myth meets mechanical reality. Subscribe to see more historically grounded myth-busting studies of military history that prioritize primary sources and technical understanding over popular narrative. What other legends of the Second World War deserve the same level of scrutiny? Share your thoughts below. Thank you for joining me in uncovering the true story behind the Tiger's catastrophic debut. Until next time.